August 1953. A crowd surges through the streets of Tehran, chanting for the fall of their own prime minister. What they do not know, what most of them will never know, is that the crowd is not real. It is rented, paid for in cash, in a currency that flows from a headquarters 7,000 miles away in Langley, Virginia. Within 72 hours, Iran's first democratically elected government will be gone. And this will not be the last time. Between 1953 and 1973, 20 years, almost to the month, the United States helps tear down 14 governments across 4 continents. Some fell to bullets, some fell to bribery. Some fell to a single rumor planted in the right newspaper on the right morning. Presidents, prime ministers, and prophets of independence, men who had been elected, crowned, or had simply led their people out of colonial rule, all of them, in the eyes of Washington, became problems to be solved. This is the story of the CIA's darkest chapter. The 2 decades when a handful of planners in Virginia decided which nations were allowed to govern themselves and which were not.
Mohammad Mossadegh was not a communist. He was a constitutional lawyer, a landowner from an aristocratic family, elected prime minister by his own parliament on a wave of genuine popular support. His crime, in the eyes of London and Washington, was a single act of economic sovereignty. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, reclaiming it from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British firm that paid the Iranian government a smaller share of its own oil profits than it paid in taxes to the British government itself. Britain wanted Mossadegh gone immediately. Washington, under a new president more anxious about the precedent of nationalization spreading than about the politics of one prime minister, agreed to help. The joint operation carried a code name that would become infamous: Ajax. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of a former American president, arrived in Tehran with a suitcase stuffed with cash and a plan built on chaos. Bribed newspaper editors began branding Mossadegh a secret communist. Paid agitators staged pro-communist riots in his name to frighten the middle class, while other paid agitators, on the very same days, staged riots against him to make it look as though the country itself had turned. The plan's first move was a royal decree from the young Shah dismissing Mossadegh outright. It failed within hours. The prime minister had the decree's messenger arrested, and the terrified Shah fled the country by private plane. Any ordinary intelligence operation would have ended there. This one did not. Roosevelt pressed forward with a second wave, flooding the streets of Tehran with paid crowds and sympathetic army units. Soldiers switched sides in real time. By August the 19th, Mossadegh was arrested in his own pajamas, and the Shah flew back to Tehran to reclaim a throne he had almost lost. A throne he now owed not to his people, but to a foreign intelligence agency. For the next 26 years, Iran was ruled by a monarch propped up by American money, trained by the CIA, and protected by a secret police force, Savak, built with direct American assistance. When that monarchy finally collapsed in the revolution of 1979, the new Iran that rose in its place remembered exactly who had kept the Shah on his throne for a quarter of a century. Operation Ajax did not simply topple a government in 1953. It planted a grievance that still shapes the entire geopolitics of the Middle East 7 decades later. In Guatemala, the CIA did not overthrow a dictator. It overthrew a farmer's advocate. President Jacobo Arbenz had been elected in a landslide on a platform of modernization, and his defining policy was land reform, redistributing unused farmland to Guatemala's overwhelmingly rural, overwhelmingly poor population. Among the landowners affected was the United Fruit Company, an American corporation so politically connected
that its former legal counsel now sat as the U.S. Secretary of State, and its board included the director of the CIA's own brother. United Fruit's lobbying machine in Washington painted Arbenz's modest reforms as the first beachhead of Soviet communism in the Western Hemisphere. The CIA responded with Operation PB Success, one of the first large-scale uses of psychological warfare as a substitute for a real invasion. A tiny mercenary force, barely large enough to be called an army, crossed the border from Honduras. What made the operation work was not the soldiers. It was the radio station broadcasting fabricated reports of a massive uprising sweeping the country, combined with a handful of dramatic but militarily insignificant airstrikes on the capital, designed purely to look and sound like the beginning of a full invasion. Arbenz's own military, larger and better equipped than the invading force, could have crushed it in a single day. But the psychological campaign convinced his generals that resistance was futile and that American military intervention was imminent. They refused to fight. Arbenz resigned and fled into exile, eventually dying, embittered and impoverished, in Mexico. In his place came a military government under Carlos Castillo Armas, the first in an unbroken line of juntas and strongmen that would rule Guatemala for the next 4 decades, triggering a civil war that killed more than 200,000 people, most of them indigenous Maya civilians. United Fruit got its land back within the year. The company itself would not survive the century, but the war it helped ignite outlived it by generations. Not every operation on this list succeeded, and Syria is where the pattern first broke. As Damascus tilted toward Cairo and Moscow in the mid-1950s, the CIA and Britain's MI6 drew up a joint conspiracy, first codenamed Operation Straggle, and later revived as the so-called Preferred Plan. The blueprint called for arming friendly tribal and political factions inside Syria, staging deliberate border incidents with Iraq and Jordan to manufacture a pretext for those countries to intervene militarily, and assassinating a short list of senior Syrian military and intelligence officers to trigger a friendly coup from within the army itself. It was, on paper, one of the most ambitious plans on this entire list. It never had the chance to unfold. Syrian counterintelligence, tipped off through their own sources, uncovered the plot before a single shot was fired. Damascus arrested the local conspirators, publicly exposed the foreign plot on state radio, and expelled Western diplomats en masse. Rather than weakening Syria's alignment with Moscow, the failed coup became proof, in the eyes of the Syrian government and its public, that the West could not be trusted, driving Damascus even further into the Soviet orbit for the next 2 decades of the Cold War. The operation designed to prevent a communist-aligned Syria helped guarantee one. Indonesia's President Sukarno frustrated Washington not once, but twice across a single decade, and paid for it both times. In 1958, alarmed by Sukarno's growing tolerance of Indonesia's large communist party, the CIA armed and funded rebel military colonels on the outer islands of Sumatra and Sulawesi, hoping to fracture the young nation and force Sukarno from power by splitting the archipelago apart. American pilots, flying under false flags and false identities, ran bombing missions in direct support of the rebellion. One of them, Alan Pope, was shot down and captured alive, his identification papers exposing direct American involvement to the entire world. Sukarno, rather than falling, used the humiliating evidence to strengthen his own position. The rebellion collapsed within months, and Washington was forced into a quiet, embarrassing retreat. 7 years later, a second and far darker opportunity arrived. Following a violent, still disputed incident on the night of September 30th, 1965, blamed on the Indonesian Communist Party, General Suharto moved swiftly against both the party and Sukarno's government.
Declassified American embassy cables, released decades later, confirm that U.S. officials provided the Indonesian army with lists containing thousands of names of suspected communists and left-wing organizers to be tracked down and eliminated. In the purge that followed over the coming months, credible estimates range from 500,000 to well over 1 million dead. General Suharto emerged from the bloodshed to rule Indonesia for the next 32 years, becoming one of Washington's most dependable Cold War allies in Southeast Asia.
High in the Himalayas, the CIA ran one of the strangest and least known campaigns on this entire list. Young Tibetan resistance fighters were secretly flown out of the region, trained in guerrilla warfare, radio operation, and parachute jumps at a covert base in the mountains of Colorado, then flown back and dropped into Tibet to fight the occupying forces of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In March of 1959, as Chinese troops closed in around the capital, Lhasa, following a popular uprising against Beijing's rule, CIA-trained guerrillas helped guide and protect the 14-year-old Dalai Lama on a grueling 3-week escape across the highest mountain passes on Earth into exile in India, an operation that continues to shape the geopolitics of the region to this very day. But the wider guerrilla campaign inside Tibet, isolated deep behind Chinese lines with no realistic path to resupply, could never seriously threaten Chinese control of the plateau. Support for the resistance was quietly wound down through the late 1960s and formally abandoned in the early 1970s, the moment Washington's strategic priorities shifted toward opening relations with Beijing itself. In landlocked Laos, a 3-way civil war between royalist generals, neutralist officers, and the communist Pathet Lao movement became one of the Cold War's most secretive proxy battlegrounds. When a young neutralist paratroop commander, Kong Lee, seized the capital in a surprise 1960 coup, the CIA moved to back a rival right-wing general and began quietly arming a growing secret army of Hmong hill fighters under the command of General Vang Pao. What began as a modest covert support mission ballooned over the following decade into the single largest paramilitary operation in the CIA's entire history. American aircraft, flown by CIA-contracted pilots, dropped more explosive tonnage on Laos than the United States and its allies dropped on both Germany and Japan combined during the whole of the Second World War. Without Congress ever formally declaring war, and without most of the American public ever learning their country was fighting one. Laos's government was never fully or permanently toppled, but it was hollowed out, propped up, bombed, and fought over for more than a decade in a war so hidden it became known, even among the officials running it, simply as the Secret War. Patrice Lumumba became the Congo's first prime minister after independence from Belgium in June of 1960, and lasted less than 3 months in office. His fiercely nationalist, non-aligned rhetoric alarmed both Washington and Brussels, each fearing Soviet influence over the Congo's vast reserves of copper, cobalt, and uranium. The CIA station chief in Leopoldville received direct authorization from the highest levels of the American government to have Lumumba assassinated. A poison intended for his toothpaste was actually prepared and flown into the country, though it was never used. Instead, the agency funneled money, weapons, and political support to a rival army colonel, Joseph Mobutu, who placed Lumumba under house arrest, then allowed him to be captured attempting to flee. Lumumba was beaten, transported to the secessionist province of Katanga, and executed by firing squad in January of 1961. His body was dismembered and dissolved in acid to destroy any evidence of the crime. Mobutu, having eliminated his rival, seized full power in 1965, renamed the country Zaire, and ruled it for the next 32 years, looting an estimated $5 billion from the national treasury while remaining, throughout, one of Washington's most steadfast allies on the African continent. Rafael Trujillo had ruled the Dominican Republic with almost unmatched brutality for 3 decades, a regime responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, including the massacre of thousands of Haitian migrants in a single week in 1937. Washington had backed him for most of that time as a reliable anti-communist strongman. By the early 1960s, his growing instability and international embarrassment made him, in Washington's calculation, a greater liability than an asset. The CIA supplied weapons, including rifles smuggled through the American consulate itself, to a group of Dominican conspirators who ambushed Trujillo's car on a highway outside the capital in May of 1961 and shot him dead. What followed was not the democracy Washington had hoped for, but years of chaos and competing juntas, ending in a second direct American intervention just 4 years later, when more than 20,000 U.S. Marines landed to prevent the return to power of a democratically elected, left-leaning former president. Not every operation on this list succeeded, and none failed more publicly or more consequentially than Cuba. After Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces overthrew the Batista government in 1959, the CIA began training some 1,500 Cuban exiles at a secret camp in Guatemala, planning to land the brigade at the Bay of Pigs, spark a popular uprising against Castro, and topple his young government within days. But Cuban intelligence had already infiltrated the exile organization months earlier. Castro's forces were waiting, fully mobilized, when the invasion force came ashore in April of 1961. President Kennedy, wary of exposing direct American military involvement, withheld the promised American air cover at the most critical moment of the battle. Within 72 hours, the invasion had completely collapsed. More than 1,000 exiles were captured, and over 100 were killed. The failure humiliated the new Kennedy administration on the world stage, pushed Castro decisively and permanently into the Soviet orbit, and set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis just 18 months later. The single closest moment the entire Cold War came to escalating into nuclear war.
President João Goulart's land reform agenda and economic nationalism alarmed both Washington and Brazil's own conservative military establishment. The CIA funneled money into opposition media outlets and organized mass street protests under the banner of anti-communism, while the US Navy quietly positioned an aircraft carrier task force off the Brazilian coast under the code name Operation Brother Sam. Fuel and weapons ready to be delivered to the plotting generals if their coup ran into unexpected resistance. In the end, it barely needed to. Goulart fled the country within days as the military seized power in March of 1964, with almost no fighting at all. What followed was 21 years of military dictatorship, marked by torture, censorship, and the disappearance of hundreds of political opponents. One of the longest-lasting single outcomes of any operation on this entire list.
Kwame Nkrumah, known to his people by the honorific Osajifo, the Redeemer, was the towering figure of African independence, leading Ghana to become the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free of colonial rule in 1957. Through the 1960s, his growing embrace of Pan-African unity, non-alignment, and closer ties with Moscow and Beijing increasingly alarmed Washington. In February of 1966, while Nkrumah was thousands of miles away on a state visit to Beijing, Ghanaian military and police officers seized power in a swift, largely bloodless coup. Documents declassified decades later confirmed that the CIA's station in Accra had been in direct contact with the plotters for months beforehand, tracking their preparations closely and, by multiple credible accounts, providing both funding and encouragement. Nkrumah never set foot in Ghana again, living out the rest of his life in exile before dying 6 years later, still regarded across much of the African continent as the father of its independence movement. Bolivia found itself in Washington's crosshairs 3 separate times within a single decade. In 1964, the CIA quietly supported a military faction that ousted President Victor Paz Estenssoro as Cold War alignments inside the country's own government shifted. 3 years later, in 1967, CIA operatives worked directly alongside Bolivian special forces to hunt down the revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara, who had entered the country to spark a continent-wide uprising. Captured, wounded, and exhausted, Guevara was executed without trial in a rural schoolhouse in La Higuera the following day, his hands severed afterward to confirm his identity to Washington. Then, in 1971, the CIA backed General Hugo Banzer in a violent coup against the reformist, left-leaning government of General Juan José Torres, installing a military regime that would rule with an iron grip for the next 7 years, one of the most consistent, repeated patterns of American intervention found anywhere across this entire 20-year campaign. Prince Norodom Sihanouk had spent years trying to keep Cambodia neutral in the widening war next door in Vietnam, quietly tolerating North Vietnamese supply routes through Cambodian territory, while publicly condemning escalating American bombing campaigns. In March of 1970, while Sihanouk was traveling abroad, his own prime minister, General Lon Nol, seized power in a coup back home. The precise level of American foreknowledge remains genuinely disputed among historians to this day, but what is not disputed is that Washington recognized the new military government within hours and began funneling military support almost immediately afterward. The consequences were catastrophic. Cambodia, previously spared the worst of the regional war, was dragged fully into it. American bombing intensified dramatically across the countryside, displacing millions of rural Cambodians and shattering the nation's fragile economy. The resulting devastation and chaos directly fueled the rise of the Khmer Rouge, whose genocidal regime, beginning in 1975, would go on to kill approximately 2 million of its own citizens, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population. Salvador Allende made history in 1970 as the first democratically elected Marxist head of state anywhere in Latin America. President Nixon's instructions to the CIA afterward were blunt, recorded in the agency's own internal meeting notes from the Oval Office. Make the Chilean economy scream. Over the following 3 years, the CIA funded opposition newspapers, bankrolled a nationwide truckers' strike that paralyzed the country's supply chains, and covertly cultivated contacts with military officers plotting against the government, including an earlier, botched kidnapping plot in 1970 that accidentally killed the Chilean army's own commander-in-chief, General René Schneider, simply for refusing to support a coup against his own president. On the morning of September the 11th, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet's forces stormed the presidential palace, La Moneda, with tanks and fighter jets. Allende, refusing to surrender, died inside the burning palace by his own hand as soldiers closed in on the building. The 17-year military dictatorship that followed killed or forcibly disappeared more than 3,000 Chileans and tortured tens of thousands more in a network of secret detention camps. Of every single operation on this entire 20-year list, Chile remains, to this day, the most infamous. By the mid-1970s, the pattern could no longer stay hidden. A wave of investigative journalism, followed by a U.S. Senate committee led by Idaho Senator Frank Church, dragged 2 decades of secret operations into the light. Assassination plots against foreign leaders, illegal domestic surveillance of American citizens, covert mind control experimentation, and regime change operations spanning 4 continents. Nearly all of it conducted with almost no meaningful oversight from Congress or the American public for over 20 straight years. The Church Committee's findings shocked the country and forced permanent reforms. New Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees, a formal presidential executive order banning assassination as an instrument of American foreign policy, and a legal requirement that the president personally authorize any future covert action in writing. 14 governments, 20 years, millions of lives altered and, in many cases, ended by decisions made in quiet conference rooms thousands of miles from the countries they permanently reshaped.
None of these 14 operations happened in isolation. Each one taught the planners who came after it what worked and what did not. Iran taught them that a paid crowd in the street could topple a government more cheaply than any army ever could. Guatemala taught them that a radio broadcast could defeat a real military without firing a single meaningful shot. Chile taught them that an economy, starved carefully enough, could be broken as completely as any battlefield. The Cold War that produced this 20-year campaign ended decades ago. The doctrine it perfected never fully disappeared. Where every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind.